They say the older you get, the quieter your world becomes. But nobody ever warned me how loud loneliness could feel out here on this ranch, where the wind still carries the smell of hay and old leather. Every creaking floorboard sounds like a memory trying to speak. My name is Bernadette Harlow. I'm 72 years old, and I built this land with my bare hands and a heart full of love. My husband and I raised a family here, buried dreams and planted roots here. And now, the only thing growing is the space between me and the people I once called my own. But let me tell you something. This isn't just a story about growing old and being forgotten. This is a revenge story, the kind that doesn't come with fireworks or fists, but with silence, dignity, and a slow reclaiming of everything they thought they could erase. I woke up before sunrise like I always did, out of habit more than need. My bones creaked a little louder each morning, but I still made it down the stairs without complaint. I like to sit at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and listen to the birds start their day, before the world remembered I was still in it. The ranch had always been loud in its own way, the stomping of hooves in the barn, the snorting of horses, the bang of the screen door slamming in the wind. But that morning, it felt too quiet, like something was waiting. The house smelled like cedar and dust, with just a hint of lavender from the drawer sachets I'd tucked into the linen cabinet years ago. My husband, Ray, used to say our home smelled like comfort. He's been gone 6 years now, but I still talk to him some mornings, just to keep the silence from swallowing me whole. I was stirring a pot of oatmeal on the stove when I heard the gravel shift outside. A truck. I wiped my hands on my apron and looked out the window. Dennis's pickup was rolling up the drive, kicking up a tail of dust behind it. He hadn't called. That wasn't like him. When the engine cut off, I stepped onto the porch. "You all right?" I called out as he slammed the door shut. He gave me that tight smile he'd perfected sometime in his 30s, after he got into real estate and learned how to sell things people didn't need. "Morning, Ma," he said. "Thought I'd stop in. Got something I've been working on." I didn't ask what. Dennis always had a plan, some big idea. A new venture that was going to change everything. I nodded and stepped aside. "Coffee's on." He followed me in, looking around the place like he was already measuring the walls. "You ever think about remodeling?" he asked as he settled into Ray's old chair. "No," I said simply. "This house doesn't need change. It just needs living." He didn't respond, just stared out the window for a moment. Then he launched into a whole presentation, said he'd been thinking about turning the ranch into a luxury eco-lodge, that people from the city were paying good money these days to sleep under the stars and pretend they knew anything about real work. I listened. I always listened. That's what mothers do. When he finished, I asked, "And where exactly do you see me in all that?" He blinked, like he hadn't expected the question. "You'd still live here, of course. Maybe not in the main house. Guests need that space. But there's that old storage cabin down near the creek. I could fix it up for you. Be cozy." "Cozy," I repeated, letting the words sit on my tongue like something sour. He smiled again. "It's just logistics." "Ma, you know I love you. I just think this place could finally start pulling its weight." I wanted to scream, to throw something, but I didn't. I just nodded, like I was thinking it over. But inside, something was shifting. It wasn't just what he said, it was how easily he said it. Like I was an afterthought, a footnote on my own land. After Dennis left, I stood at the window and watched his truck disappear down the dirt road. The coffee had gone cold in my cup, but I didn't notice. All I could feel was the slow, sinking weight of being unnecessary. Not unloved, maybe, but unneeded. That was worse. That night, I sat out on the porch with one of Ray's old flannel blankets wrapped around my shoulders. The stars were out, and the wind carried the familiar scent of horses and pine sap. I thought about all the nights Ray and I sat there, dreaming about our future. We built this ranch from nothing. Every fence post, every shingle, every line in the soil bore our names. And now my son wanted to carve us out of it, smooth the story over, repackage it into something that fit his version of success. I held that truth in my chest like a stone, heavy, cold, but not dead. Something in me hardened that night. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was clarity. But I knew one thing. I was done being quiet. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't beg. But I also wouldn't be erased, because the one thing I still had, after all the years and the losses and the quiet mornings alone, was this land. And I was about to remind my son exactly who it belonged to. Dennis didn't wait long. A week after our conversation on the porch, he came back with a contractor in tow. I saw the truck pull up from the garden, where I was weeding the lavender bed. 2 men stepped out, both in sunglasses and leather work gloves, like they were about to gut a kitchen on some HGTV special. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked up to meet them. "Ma," Dennis said, tone bright, like he was announcing good news. "This is Corey. He's just going to take a look at the structure. See what we're working with." "We're not working with anything," I said, straightening my back. "The house is fine." Corey smiled like I hadn't spoken. "Morning, Mrs. Harlow. Don't worry, I won't touch a thing. Just scoping it out. Real solid bones. By the way, original timber. Ray cut it himself," I said, eyes not leaving Dennis. And last I checked, he wasn't taking bids on his memory. Dennis placed a hand on my shoulder like he was calming a horse. "It's just exploratory. Mom, you'll see. It's all going to be beautiful." I said nothing. Just stepped aside and let them walk inside. My home, my kitchen, my hallway lined with family pictures, now stared at like they were just staging clutter. I stood on the porch while they moved through the rooms, voices rising and falling behind the windows. That afternoon, Dennis sat me down at the dining table like I was some aging guest in my own house. "Ma," he said, unfolding a rough sketch on a yellow legal pad. "Look, this is the new concept. We keep the structure, but open up the kitchen. Bring in glass doors overlooking the range. Outdoor spa right where the vegetable garden used to be." I glanced at the drawing. My kitchen, Ray's kitchen, was gone. The worn table, the cabinets he built by hand, the corner where I had stood every Thanksgiving carving turkey, erased in a few pencil lines. "And the garden," I asked quietly. "We'll replant lavender on the spa path," he said, a nod to the history, a nod. It's strange how a small word like that can hit harder than a fist. He wasn't just remodeling the house. He was rewriting our lives like it was his to curate. And then, as if it were nothing, Dennis added, "Also, I've asked the boys to start clearing out the office upstairs. We'll need that for the lounge area. Might be easier if you moved your things to the back room for now." "My things," I echoed. He nodded, sipping his coffee. "Photos, files, all that stuff from before, just while we transition." He said it so casual, like it didn't mean anything. But that room, Ray's office, was full of our whole marriage. Photos, documents, the journals he kept for 30 years. It was the room he died in, sitting by the window in his old leather chair, holding my hand. "You're making decisions without me," I said, still calm, though my hands trembled in my lap. "This isn't a partnership. Dennis, you're taking over." He didn't argue. That was the worst part. He just gave me that tired, sympathetic smile and said, "I'm just doing what's best for everyone." Everyone, I thought, except the woman who held this place together while he was off chasing deals and divorcing wives. I spent that night sitting at the edge of my bed in the little guest room, the one he wanted me to move into full time. The mattress sagged. The walls were thin, and it smelled like a room no one had ever loved. It felt like being in a waiting room for the rest of my life. The next morning, I walked into the office before the sun came up. I touched every shelf, every spine of the books Ray loved, every photograph frame still warm with memory. Then I packed the most precious things into 3 boxes. That was all I allowed myself. The rest would sit there, waiting for someone who still remembered what they meant. I placed the boxes in the corner of the guest room, then stared at them a long while. "Tell me something. Friends, have you ever stood in a room filled with your own memories and felt like an intruder? Like the story you wrote in Sweat and Sacrifice was now being edited by someone else's hand? If you have, you'll understand what I felt in that moment. And if you haven't, God, I hope you never do. Later that day, Dennis brought in an interior designer. She was young, in heels far too clean for a ranch, walking through my home with a tablet in hand and eyes full of buzzwords. "The light here is nice," she said, "but the walls are so heavy. All this wood, it's too dark. Too nostalgic." That was the word she used. Too nostalgic. As if memory was something we should dust off and discard. I turned away before she saw my face. That night, when Dennis came to say goodnight like I was a tenant in a guest house, I asked him a question. "Dennis," I said, "what would your father say if he saw all this?" He paused, just for a moment. "Dad was always resistant to change," he said finally. "That's why you had to carry so much." I nodded. But inside, something cracked. Not because he was wrong, but because he used it as an excuse to wipe away the very man who taught him everything. I laid in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of my home being measured, sized up, prepped for a future I wasn't invited to be part of. And I realized something simple and painful. They weren't just changing the house. They were changing me, reducing me, pushing me quietly out of the center of my own life. And I had let them, for now. The day Dennis told me to move out of the main house just for the season, he didn't even look up from his phone. I was making biscuits, the way Ray liked them, flaky, with a bit of cheddar and black pepper. And Dennis just sat at the counter tapping away, talking numbers to someone on speaker. Then he said it, real casual. "We're bringing in investors next week. They'll need to stay in the main house. You should probably settle into the bunkhouse until things calm down." I turned to look at him. "The bunkhouse?" "Yeah," he said, like it was no big deal. "We'll fix it up. Corey's already bringing in a space heater and a bed frame. It's temporary." Temporary, that word again. It had followed me around like a stray dog ever since Dennis came back. I wanted to ask what would happen after temporary, but I already knew the answer. That evening, I walked across the property to the bunkhouse, an old, sagging one-room shack near the tree line, built decades ago for the ranch hands. The roof had a soft leak. The floor dipped in the middle like it had grown tired of holding people up. A few moths fluttered in the corner, and the place smelled like mouse droppings and rain-damp wood. And this, apparently, was where I belonged now. I sat on the edge of the cot Dennis had brought in. It creaked under me. No insulation, no running water, no windows that shut properly. Just 4 walls and a roof, barely. I stared out the warped window at the house glowing warm in the distance, the home I'd built over 40 years. I thought about every Christmas, every late-night fever, every graduation photo on the hallway wall. I had poured my life into that house like it was sacred. Now I wasn't even allowed to sleep under its roof. I didn't cry that night. I didn't even speak. I just sat in that bunkhouse, wrapped in one of Ray's old jackets, and let the cold settle into my bones. And in that silence, I felt something collapse quietly inside me. Not my pride. It had already been chipped away. Not my sense of home. That was long gone. What collapsed was the hope I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. Hope that Dennis would see me, that he'd remember who I was to him. What I had given. The next morning, I went to the main house to gather a few more of my things. My photographs had been taken off the walls. The hallway was bare. The bookshelf in the living room had been cleared. Ray's Western novels gone. In their place, travel guides, glossy catalogs, brochures for eco-lodges. Even the coffee table had been swapped for something modern and cold. I opened the hall closet and found my family albums, 3 of them, sitting in a cardboard box near the garbage bin. I stared at them for a long time, like they might blink back at me and tell me it was all a mistake. But it wasn't. Why are these here? I asked Dennis when he came downstairs. He didn't even pretend to be surprised. We needed closet space for the gear. Corey said we should declutter. These are our lives, I said. These are your baby pictures. Your dad's old hunting trips. Our first dog. Dennis shrugged. I scanned them, as if a JPEG file could carry the weight of a life lived, as if digitizing a smile was the same as remembering the warmth behind it. That's when it really sank in. I wasn't part of the future Dennis was building. I wasn't even part of the present. I was a relic, a photograph that could be scanned, stored, and then deleted. He tried to hug me when I left the house. I stepped back, not angry, just tired. So bone-deep tired of being tolerated instead of respected, the next few days blurred into one another. I kept to the bunkhouse, ate canned soup, walked the edge of the property in the early mornings before the crew arrived. No one noticed I was gone. And why would they? I wasn't necessary anymore. One afternoon, I came back from a walk and found a stack of mail sitting on the bunkhouse step. Bills, ranch documents. One of the letters was addressed to current property resident. Not even my name. That night, as the wind rattled the loose window pane, I sat on the cot with the family albums and flipped through them by lantern light. I saw Ray's face grinning in the sun. Dennis on a pony, crying because he didn't want to wear the helmet. I saw myself in the background of so many moments, setting the table, fixing a boot, holding someone close, always behind the scenes, always holding things together. And now, there wasn't even a place for me at the table. I whispered Ray's name into the dark, not expecting an answer, just needing someone to witness me, someone who'd say, "You still matter." But all I heard was the wind. It's strange. You can live a whole life in one place, raise children, bury a husband, build a home brick by brick, and still end up a ghost on your own land. I knew then that I was disappearing, and it wasn't that Dennis didn't love me in his own narrow, selfish way. It was worse than that. He had rewritten me, from matriarch to burden, from cornerstone to afterthought, from a mother to someone in the way, and the worst part, he didn't even seem to know he'd done it. The day I overheard Dennis's phone call started like most others. Quiet, still, and slightly cold. I was out early, feeding the horses and checking the fencing along the north paddock. The frost hadn't yet lifted from the grass, and the morning sun stretched long shadows across the dirt. I liked that time of day. It was the only moment I still felt like I belonged. When I walked back toward the main house, I caught the sound of Dennis's voice echoing from the porch. He thought he was alone. He was standing near the railing, phone to his ear, pacing in tight, distracted circles like he always did when he talked business. I should have cleared my throat. Let him know I was coming up the path. But I didn't. Something stopped me. "Once she's out completely," he said, "we can push the deal through without extra signatures. She's technically still the landowner, but mentally she's not all there. No one's gonna fight it." I stopped cold. There was a pause, and then his voice dropped lower, but I still heard it, clearer than I wanted to. "She's been living in the bunkhouse for weeks, barely talks. I mean, she's old. The house has moved past her. She's just fading." He chuckled, and it was that sound, that casual laugh, that knocked the breath out of me, like I was the punchline in a joke about my own disappearance. I didn't move. I just stood there in the shadows of the willow tree, every word soaking in like cold water down the back. He kept talking, making promises, tossing around phrases like final phase and paper shuffle, while the blood pounded in my ears. He was waiting for me to vanish. Not physically. Not yet. But he'd already written me off. Already carved out my role in this new story he was selling to strangers. I wasn't his mother anymore. I was an obstacle. An old signature on a deed. A weak link in his pitch deck. He didn't see me. He saw a legal technicality he needed to quietly resolve. When he hung up, I turned around and walked back toward the trees. I didn't want him to see me. I couldn't face him just yet, not with my hands shaking and my heart hammering in my chest like I'd been slapped. I cut through the field, took the long way around, and ended up back at the bunkhouse. I sat on the cot and stared at the bare walls. The same walls I'd stared at for too many nights now, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself cry. Not loud, not for show, just soft, steady tears that slid down without asking permission. Not because I was heartbroken, not even because I was surprised. I cried because I knew deep down I had let this happen. I had handed over trust, let him make decisions, believed his tone over my instincts, I gave him the benefit of the doubt because that's what mothers do, and now he was banking on that very habit, banking on me staying silent, staying small, staying out of the way. I wiped my face with the sleeve of Ray's flannel and stared at the wooden beam overhead. It was old, cracked in the middle, weathered like me, but it still held, and something about that beam reminded me I hadn't lost everything yet. Not really. The land was still mine, legally, morally, spiritually. He might have pushed me aside, might have boxed up my life and moved me out, but he hadn't taken the deed. Not yet. That afternoon, I went to the filing cabinet I'd kept locked in the barn office, the one Dennis didn't know about. Inside were the land records. Ray and I had signed the final deed in both our names back in 1987, then amended it after his death to add a living trust, one that only activated if I passed, or if I willingly released it. Dennis hadn't done his homework, or maybe he thought I'd forgotten. But I hadn't. And in that moment, for the first time in weeks, I felt something shift in my chest, a flicker, a pulse. Not rage, not revenge, just clarity. This wasn't about holding on to property anymore. This was about holding on to myself. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the tiny desk in the bunkhouse and reread every line of that deed. I made notes, marked dates, traced Ray's signature with my finger like it was a prayer. In the morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in over 15 years, Harlan Keats. Back in the early 2000s, Harlan and Dennis had worked on a small commercial project together, a promising deal that ended with Harlan bankrupt and Dennis quietly richer. I remembered the way Harlan's hands shook the day he came to the ranch, asking for help, and how Dennis stood behind me, silent, arms crossed, stone-faced. I hadn't known the full story back then, but I knew enough now. I dialed the number printed on an old invoice from the file. I wasn't even sure it still worked, but it rang. Harlan Keats, a voice answered. "It's Bernadette Harlow," I said. There was a long pause. "Well, now that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. I think we need to talk," I said, "about land, about justice, and about what we do when someone counts on us to disappear." Another pause. Then, "You free this afternoon?" "I've got all the time in the world," I replied. But in truth, I didn't, because for the first time in this long, painful season of being erased, I felt something come back to life in me. My name, my voice, my place. Harlan showed up 3 days later in an old navy blue pickup that rattled like a box of nails. He hadn't changed much, still wore denim from head to toe, still had that sharp way of looking at people like he was measuring their soul rather than their words. He stepped out of the truck, dusted off his hat, and said, "He ever learned to stop stepping on people? Or is he still trying to turn everything into a profit?" I didn't smile. Worse, now he does it with a suit and a smile. We didn't waste time. I brought him the documents, laid them out on the little makeshift desk in the bunkhouse, and let him read through everything. I expected him to find holes, loopholes, legal traps, Dennis might have said, but instead, Harlan leaned back, let out a whistle, and said, "This land's still yours, Bernadette, every inch of it. He can't sell what he doesn't own, not unless you sign it away." I already knew that, but hearing it out loud, from someone who wasn't trying to manipulate me, made it feel real. "You got options," he said. "Sell it yourself, revoke his access, file a quiet title suit if you want it airtight, or stay quiet and wait for the right time. I'm not looking to humiliate him," I said softly, "just to remind him I exist." Harlan nodded. That might be the most dangerous kind of power there is. We spent the afternoon going over the steps, what I'd need to do, who to contact, which boundaries needed to be redrawn, both literally and legally. It felt like stitching something together after it had been torn apart. Every form, every notarized paper was a thread pulling me back toward the center of my own story. And all the while, I didn't tell Dennis. I went on letting him think I was shrinking. He still walked by the bunkhouse with that same polite pity in his eyes. Still called out, "You need anything?" "Ma," like I was some elderly neighbor he was checking on out of guilt. But I just waved. said all good, and went back to pruning the lavender or organizing Ray's old ranch ledgers. Because the truth was, I was no longer waiting for his recognition. I was reclaiming mine. I began making small changes no one noticed. I stopped entering the main house altogether, not out of resentment, but because I no longer needed to step into a space that rejected me. I took over a corner of the barn and turned it into a reading room, put in a rocker, brought out the kettle, plugged in a little radio that still played Johnny Cash and Patsy Cline. At night, I read legal documents by lamplight and sipped mint tea like it was whiskey. I felt more myself in that corner of the barn than I had in the main house for years. The animals still came to me. I'd sit in the pasture some mornings with the horses brushing up beside me, warm and silent and real. They didn't care about contracts or redesigns or investment plans. They knew who I was. One evening, while Dennis was away on a development conference in Santa Fe, I walked up the ridge behind the property. It was where Ray and I used to sit when the sun went down, back before the ranch had internet, back when we measured time in seasons and fence posts, not in spreadsheets. I carried a small notebook and a fountain pen, sat cross-legged under the tree and started writing out a list. Not of tasks, not even of goals, just of things I still owned. My name, my stories, my voice, the way Ray's hand felt in mine, the smell of wood smoke in autumn, the deed to the land. The truth, that was enough. Not everything needed to be loud to be powerful. Not every act of resistance needed an audience. Some battles are won just by choosing to remain standing when the world tries to make you sit down. Around that time, I started noticing subtle shifts. The contractor stopped showing up every day. One of the investors, young, clean-shaven, cocky, came out for a tour and didn't stay past lunch. I overheard Corey arguing on the phone about uncertain land rights and delays in ownership transfer. It was working, quietly, legally, and not one soul knew it was me pulling the thread. Dennis came home from his trip, tense. He asked if I'd heard from the county office. I said no, sipping my tea like I was talking about the weather. He didn't press. Maybe he still thought I was too tired to meddle. Let him. Let him keep underestimating the woman who taught him how to tie his boots, who sat in a hospital chair through 2 of his surgeries, who baked from scratch every year for his ungrateful birthday guests. Let him think I'd just become background noise, because while he planned his next move, I had already made mine. I filed the paperwork quietly, reasserting control over the land, rescinding verbal permissions, blocking any transfers not signed by me. I didn't need to call him into a room and make a scene. I didn't need to tell him a thing. I had the law. And I had time. That's the thing nobody tells you about aging. People think your silence is surrender. But sometimes, silence is a strategy. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one holding the match. And I had just lit mine. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, quiet. Gray skies, wind barely brushing through the tall grass. I was trimming back the lavender beds when Dennis's voice came sharp and strained through the line. Ma, you need to come up to the house, now. I didn't rush. I finished what I was doing, wiped my hands on my apron, and took the long path toward the porch. The same porch where, just a few months ago, he'd stood planning how to erase me like a scribble in his blueprint. He was pacing in the foyer when I arrived, flanked by Corey and the sharp-dressed investor I'd seen weeks ago. The buyer looked flustered, muttering about permits and title discrepancies. Dennis turned to me like he was seeing a ghost in daylight. Ma, did you file something? He asked. I took off my gloves and folded them slowly, deliberately. Before I answered, I did. What exactly? He demanded, voice higher now, eyes darting to the others in the room. I met his gaze. I filed to reassert full control of the property, the land, the house, the structures, everything. You don't have signing authority. You never did. And you knew that. The silence in the room was almost sacred. Corey cleared his throat. So, the deal's dead. No, I said, voice even. The deal never existed. Because you tried to sell something that was never yours. Dennis turned red, then pale. His mouth opened. then closed. He looked like he wanted to yell, to beg, to explain. But all he could manage was, "Why didn't you tell me? You never asked." I said, "You assumed." That's when I saw it. The first flicker of something real in his eyes. Not anger, not greed, shame. He stood still for once, not pacing, not talking, just standing there in the house I had built, with the walls he once scribbled on as a boy, and the roof that had sheltered every version of him I had loved. He looked around like he was suddenly seeing it all for the first time. "You were going to kick me out," I said gently. "You were going to turn this place into a retreat for strangers. You tossed out the photos. You boxed up our life. And I still didn't stop you, not until I had to." He sat down on the edge of the stairwell, elbows on knees, head in his hands. The investor mumbled something about needing to get back to the office and walked out, Corey behind him. The house was quiet again. I didn't stay. I left him sitting there, with the silence pressing in. Outside, the wind picked up. The sun peeked through the clouds. I walked back down the path toward the bunkhouse, toward my new sanctuary. But this time, I wasn't retreating. I was returning. That weekend, I held a small gathering in the barn. I invited 3 of my oldest friends, widows, mostly women who had been forgotten in one way or another. We drank cider and laughed until our ribs ached. I showed them the new reading corner, the rocker Ray had fixed before he passed, the old radio that still hummed like it knew how to keep secrets. We didn't talk about children much, not because we were bitter, but because we were whole. A week later, I put up a small sign by the entrance of the ranch. Just past the main gate, it read, "No longer accepting investors. Only memories allowed." Some afternoons, Dennis still walks the property. He nods from a distance. Sometimes he says hi. Sometimes he doesn't. That's fine. He lives nearby now, in town. Started working for a land brokerage firm. I hear he's not quite as flashy these days. And the house, it's still mine. I didn't renovate it. I didn't tear down a single wall. I let it breathe again, put back the old bookshelf, dusted off the photos, brought Ray's books back out where they belonged. It's not about revenge. It never was. It's about remembrance, about making sure the people who build things, the ones who stay, who love, who sacrifice don't get erased just because someone else wants to fast forward the story. And maybe that's what makes this a revenge story, in its own quiet way. Not a loud one, not cruel, but a story where the one who gave everything finally, silently, gets to keep what's hers. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever been made to feel like a burden in the house you built? Have you ever watched your name slowly disappear from your own story? If you have, then you know exactly why I didn't need to scream. I just needed to stay, and I did. Fall came early that year. The air crisped in late August, and by September, the maples had already started to blush red. I noticed it one morning while hanging laundry. The leaves, just starting to turn. Ray always said fall was the season of truth, the season when things stopped pretending to be what they weren't. The ranch was quiet now. No construction crews, no investors pacing the gravel drive, no whispers in the hallway, just wind, birds, and the occasional creak of a barn door, the way it used to be, the way it should have stayed. Dennis didn't come around as much. I knew he was still licking his wounds, sorting out the mess he'd made of his pride and his plans. He hadn't apologized, not directly, but then again, some men are built with apologies locked deep in their ribs. Doesn't mean they aren't sorry, just means they don't know how to say it out loud. Instead, he started showing up once a week to mow the back pasture or check on the plumbing. I didn't ask him to. He didn't ask for permission, but I let him. That's the thing about quiet forgiveness. It's not always spoken. Sometimes it's just leaving the gate unlocked. One Sunday, I found a small paper bag on the bunkhouse step. Inside was a jar of fig preserves and a folded note. From the farmer's market, it said. They reminded me of you. It wasn't much, but it was something. And that something carried more weight than any grand gesture ever could. I didn't call him. I didn't write back. I just left a slice of toast with the preserves on the kitchen counter the next time he came by. He didn't mention it. But the next week, he fixed the squeaky screen door without being asked. Little things, quiet shifts. Like the way sunlight starts to hit the floor differently when the season changes. Not all at once, but surely. Meanwhile, I kept living. I joined the local quilting circle again, brought out my old singer machine and stitched in silence with women who knew how to carry stories without saying a word. I taught a neighbor's granddaughter how to bake sourdough from scratch. I walked the fence line every morning with the same steady boots I wore when Dennis was still in diapers. And every evening, I sat on the porch and watched the house, not in bitterness, but in peace. It was mine, not just by deed or paper, but by memory. Every floorboard held a laugh. Every window remembered a birthday. That kind of history can't be sold off, no matter how polished the presentation. People in town had started whispering. Of course, they'd heard bits and pieces. She kept the land. He tried to sell it. She outsmarted him. I didn't feed the gossip. I didn't confirm or deny. Let them talk. Because this wasn't about what others saw. It was about what I remembered and what I refused to forget. One afternoon, I stood by the old willow tree near the South Ridge, the one where I used to push Dennis on a tire swing. The rope was gone now, but the branch was still strong. I stood there a long while, hand on the bark, eyes on the open field, and I realized something. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for an apology, not for recognition, not for anyone to tell me I had value. I already knew the world hadn't changed. It would still find ways to dismiss women like me, quiet women, older women, women who gave everything and asked for little. But I had changed, and maybe that was enough. I didn't win by shouting. I won by staying, by holding the line, by refusing to be erased. And that, I believe, is a kind of victory more lasting than any revenge. It was mid-October when the letter arrived. A simple white envelope, addressed to me in Dennis's handwriting. No stamp. He must have dropped it off himself. I turned it over in my hands for a moment, staring at the slightly uneven script. That alone told me it hadn't been easy for him to write. Dennis had always been confident with numbers, charts, blueprints. But words, real, heartfelt ones, those didn't come so smooth. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the paper. Ma, I don't even know where to start. I messed up. I let people get in my head. I let money and ambition make me forget what matters. What you built here, what Dad built with you, it wasn't just land. It was home. I didn't see it until I lost the right to call it mine. You didn't yell. You didn't throw me out. But you stopped letting me walk all over you. And that said more than any argument ever could. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I remember now. I remember who you are. I'm sorry. Your son. Dennis. I sat with the letter in my lap for a long time, not moving. I didn't cry, not because it didn't mean anything, but because it meant something different than he probably intended. It wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement. He finally saw me again. That evening, I didn't call him. I didn't send a message back. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out my old leather-bound journal, the one Ray gave me on our 25th wedding anniversary, and I wrote, not to Dennis, to myself. I wrote down everything I'd held in for months. The moment he told me to move out of the main house, the time I found our family photos in a cardboard box, the call he made that day, not knowing I was listening from the trees. I wrote about the cold, the silence, the ache in my chest that refused to go away, even when I was surrounded by memories. And then I wrote about now, about the peace that had finally started to settle like dust on an old shelf. The kind you don't wipe away because it belongs there. Proof that something had been still, lived in. Later that week, Dennis came by to help trim the pecan trees. He didn't bring up the letter. Neither did I. But something had changed. He moved slower, watched where he stepped. And when we took a break, he brought out 2 thermoses of coffee, one with cream and sugar, just how I liked it. He handed it to me without a word. I nodded. We sipped in silence. I've been thinking about starting something smaller, he said after a while. Maybe in town. Property management. Nothing big. I didn't say much. Just Sounds like a good plan. And it did. Not because I cared what business he ran, but because he finally realized he didn't need to use what wasn't his. He left before sunset, didn't linger, didn't try to explain again, and I didn't need him to. That night, I looked out at the ranch. The golden light hit the porch just right, turning everything soft and amber. I thought about all the women I'd known who never got this moment, never got the apology, never got the land back, never even got to tell their side. If you're listening right now and you've ever been pushed out of something you helped build, I want you to know your story doesn't have to end in silence. Some of us get our names back, even if it's scratched into old soil. Some of us, like me, learn that quiet doesn't mean powerless. And when someone finally says, "I remember who you are," you'll know you never needed their memory to begin with. You just needed your own. The frost came early again this year. It settled across the fields like a whisper, gentle, silver, and final. I stood at the edge of the pasture one morning, coffee in hand, boots deep in the grass. Watching the sun struggle to warm the frozen ground, it reminded me of myself not long ago, still standing, still present, even after being left out in the cold. Dennis had started stopping by more often, not with grand gestures or apologies, just small things. He helped patch the chicken coop, fixed a broken hinge on the old red gate, even brought me a bag of flour and a jar of homemade chili mix from the county fair. I never asked for these things, but I didn't turn them down either. I think he was trying to show up in ways he didn't know how to before. One afternoon, he brought Maya along, his daughter, my granddaughter. She was 7 now, missing her front teeth. With the same wide eyes Dennis had at that age, she ran up the path, arms outstretched like she belonged here, like she'd never felt the silence that had passed between her father and me. "Grandma, do you still have the swing?" she asked. It took me a second to realize what she meant. The old tire swing Ray had hung from the willow tree 30 years ago. We'd taken it down after a storm cracked the branch. But I still had the tire, still had the rope. Dennis looked at me then, not pleading, not pushing, just watching. We spent the afternoon restringing the swing, the 3 of us. Dennis climbed the ladder while I tied the knots. Maya danced barefoot in the leaves, singing some schoolyard song I didn't recognize. When the swing was finally up, she leapt into it and squealed as Dennis pushed her gently. And for a moment, it felt like something was healing, not loudly, not perfectly. But truthfully, later, Dennis stayed behind while Maya explored the garden. We sat on the porch, the air thick with the smell of firewood and old leaves. "I don't deserve to be part of this place," he said quietly. "No," I replied, "but it's not about deserving. It's about remembering." He looked down at his hands. "I forgot who you were." "Ma, you forgot who you were too." He nodded, and that was the end of it. I didn't need more. You know, some of you watching this might be wondering, do people like that really change? Can a child who broke your heart ever become someone you let back in? I don't have a perfect answer, but I'll tell you this. Change doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like a tire swing tied back up by the same hands that once let it fall. We didn't erase the past. That's not how it works. But we didn't let it define the future either. In the following weeks, I found myself doing things I hadn't done in years. Baking from scratch, humming while I worked, even hosting a small dinner with a few neighbors I'd pulled away from when things got dark. They noticed. "Bernie, you're glowing," one of them said with a wink. "That bunkhouse suits you." I just smiled. Because it wasn't the bunkhouse. It was the quiet power of reclaiming your place without having to fight for it anymore. That night, I lit a single candle on the dining table, the one Ray and I had built with our hands, and watched the flame dance. Not for any occasion, just because, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own story. I felt like the author again, like I'd picked up the pen and decided which chapters were worth keeping and which I could finally let go. Winter settled in slow, like a hush over the land. Mornings came with soft mist curling over the fields, and the evenings stretched longer, quieter. I began lighting the fireplace most nights, not for the heat, but for the ritual. The sound of the crackling logs reminded me of the early days, when Ray and I would sit side by side and plan out our tomorrows with nothing but faith and calloused hands. One afternoon, I was cleaning out the attic of the main house when I came across a cardboard box tucked deep behind the rafters. It was labeled in Dennis's handwriting, "Mom's things, old," as if the word old explained everything, as if it justified why those things had been pushed out of sight. I opened it. Inside were my recipe cards, some of Ray's old shirts, a stack of handwritten notes from friends long past, and a baby blanket I'd crocheted when Dennis was born. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. I sat down on the dusty floorboards and ran my fingers over each item. One by one, they weren't just things. They were proofs. Proof that I had lived, loved, built, given. Proof that I had mattered. It wasn't anger I felt. Not anymore. Just a quiet, steady sense of justice. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that waits. That endures. Later that evening, I set a few of the keepsakes back where they belonged. The baby blanket in a cedar chest, the recipe cards back in the kitchen drawer. Ray's shirts folded neatly beside mine. I wasn't hiding anymore. That week, I got a letter from the county office confirming full uncontested ownership of the land. Everything was now in my name again. No loopholes. No conditions. My lawyer called it a clean title. I called it a restored truth. Dennis didn't say much when I told him, just nodded and said, "That's fair?" And it was. He wasn't the same man who'd once tried to edge me out of the story. He wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but he'd learned. And more importantly, he'd stayed, not for the land, not for what it could earn him, but for what it used to mean, and maybe what it still could. One evening, after dinner, he brought Maya out again. She ran straight to the garden, then the porch, then the barn, like she'd never left. "Maya wants to build a birdhouse," he said, scratching his neck. "Thought maybe you could help her." I almost laughed. Not at him, just at the poetry of it all. "Of course," I said. "We'll start this weekend." He lingered on the porch a little longer this time, watched Maya in the distance. "She loves it here," he said quietly. I didn't say anything. Just let the words hang there like laundry on a line, honest and plain. He looked at me then, and for the first time since all of it, he asked a real question. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" I thought about it. Really thought. "Forgiveness isn't a switch," I said. "It's a path, and we're walking it. Slowly. Together." He nodded. Before they left, Maya ran back to hug me. "Don't forget," she said. "Saturday. Birdhouse. Wouldn't miss it," I told her. And I meant it, because I wasn't disappearing anymore, and I wasn't waiting for anyone to remember me. I had already remembered myself, and that was more than enough. Saturday came with a sky so blue it felt like it had been painted there just for us. The air was cold enough to keep our breaths visible, but warm enough that our fingers didn't sting. I'd already laid out the supplies on an old picnic table beside the barn. Planks, nails, paintbrushes, even a little cup of hot cocoa for Maya with exactly 4 marshmallows floating on top. She came skipping up the path in her puffy purple coat, Dennis trailing behind. Toolbox in hand. I hadn't asked him to come, but I didn't mind that he did. "Grandma," Maya grinned. "I want to paint it like your house," I smiled. "Then we'll need soft yellow for the sides, white for the trim, and a little green for the shutters." We got to work. She handed me nails like a little apprentice, chattering about school, a class turtle named Mr. Pickles, and how she wanted to be a vet or a teacher or maybe a bird, depending on the day. I let her talk. I just listened. It had been so long since anyone told me about their dreams like that. Dennis helped cut the roof panels. I noticed he measured twice before each cut now, Ray's old rule. I didn't point it out, but something about that detail felt like a peace offering. When we finished, Maya climbed up on the porch railing while Dennis helped her hang the birdhouse on the old post by the garden. She stood back with her hands on her hips, satisfied. "Now the birds have a home too," she declared. "That they do," I said. She wandered off to play with the cats sunning themselves by the barn, and Dennis sat down beside me on the porch. We sipped coffee in silence, watching her. She's not afraid to take up space, I said. That's good. She gets that from you, he said quietly. I looked over at him. He wasn't smiling. He was serious, earnest in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy with grass-stained jeans and scraped-up elbows. I've been thinking, he went on, about making a formal amendment to the will. Not just the land, everything. Making sure Maya knows the story, knows the roots. That caught me off guard. Not the legal part. I'd already taken care of what mattered most. But the intention behind it, the fact that he wanted her to know, to remember, to carry forward. You think she's old enough for that? I asked. She's old enough to understand what love looks like, he replied, and what mistakes look like too. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The wind rustled the dried corn stalks at the edge of the field, and a hawk soared high above us. I closed my eyes for a second and just listened. It sounded like peace. Not perfect peace, but earned peace. When Maya came back, she tugged on Dennis's sleeve and asked if they could stay for supper. He looked at me, unsure. I've got chili on the stove, I said. Enough for 3, and just like that, we became something resembling family again. Not the same as before, not naive, but real. That night, after they left, I sat by the window and watched the birdhouse sway gently in the wind. No birds had come yet, but they would. It takes time to trust a place, time to call it home, and maybe that's what healing really is. Not forgetting, not pretending it didn't hurt, but building something new, right in the same soil where something once broke. To those of you listening, have you ever rebuilt something others thought was lost? Maybe not a birdhouse, maybe not a ranch, maybe just yourself. If so, then you know, sometimes the strongest things we build are the ones no one sees. Spring came in slow that year, like it had learned not to rush. The snow melted in gentle patches, revealing the brown beneath, and the ground felt soft again under my boots. I walked the fence line one morning with a mug of tea and watched the barn come alive with light. The same barn Dennis once said was too old to fix, now painted fresh and standing proud, just like me. The birdhouse Maya built was still hanging by the garden gate, only now a pair of finches had made it their home. I watched the mama bird zip in and out, her beak full of twigs and threads, building something that would last. I knew that feeling. Dennis had started coming by every weekend, sometimes with Maya, sometimes just with tools. He didn't talk much anymore. He showed up, fixed things, carried wood, painted trim, and I let him. Not because I forgot what he'd done, but because I finally understood that the real power wasn't in punishing him, it was in not needing anything from him anymore. We never had a big confrontation. No shouting match. No staged forgiveness under the porch light. Just a slow, unspoken agreement that I had drawn the line, and he had finally seen it. I was still in the bunkhouse, still my space, still my rhythm. But I had begun to step back into the main house more often. I opened the windows, rehung the photos, even put Ray's old cowboy hat on the hook by the door again. Some days, it felt like he was still around, somewhere between the ticking clock and the creak of the stairs. One morning, I went into town for the first time in a while, not for groceries, for myself. I bought a new set of garden tools, a pair of earrings I didn't need, and a slice of lemon meringue pie from the diner, a little indulgence just for me. When I walked in, the waitress, maybe 30, sharp ponytail, bright red lipstick, smiled and said, "I love your earrings. You look like someone who's got a good story." I just nodded. "Oh, honey, you have no idea." Back at the ranch, I found Maya waiting on the porch with a card in her hand. "It's for you, Grandma," she said. "I made it in school." I opened it slowly, and inside was a picture she'd drawn. A little yellow house, a big tree, a woman with gray hair standing tall. Underneath, in shaky letters, "My grandma's house. She's the boss." I laughed. That I am. That evening, we sat around the fire pit. Just the 3 of us. Maya roasted marshmallows while Dennis stacked logs. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. The stars came out one by one, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not closure, not revenge, but something deeper. I had reclaimed my home. Not just the land, not just the title, but the feeling of it, the right to exist in it fully, to breathe, to matter, to stay. And I had done it quietly, without begging, without rage, just with resolve. This wasn't a loud ending. It was a quiet recognition. And that, to me, was the most glorious part of this whole revenge story, that no one had to lose for me to win. I simply stopped handing over what was mine. Now I wake up in the mornings to bird song and the smell of warm wood. I open the door, step into the sun, and whisper to myself, "You are not invisible. You never were." To those of you watching, especially the women who've been dismissed, erased, or overlooked, I want to ask, have you ever reclaimed something they thought you just let go of? Have you ever stood quietly and said, "No more," without raising your voice? If you have, then you know this wasn't just a story about land or inheritance. It was about dignity. And sometimes, dignity walks back into the house, one quiet, steady step at a time. So tell me in the comments, what did you reclaim that they never thought you would? I'll be right here, listening.